All right, so I'm actually really excited that we split it up between junior high and high school. Again, I think probably y'all are too a little bit.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, so one reason I'm excited is because hopefully y'all are excited. But another reason is because it actually allows us to go into some deeper conversations that really, sometimes with junior high, you'll start talking about it, and about 2 minutes in, they'll start getting distracted and talking. And so usually you go with something a little bit easier to talk about. At the end of the last year, we started doing the whole question box thing, right? And there were a few questions we received that are really some tougher questions. And I would get up here and give like 3-minute answers to some questions, but some of them kind of deserved much longer talks, right? And it was ones that it was kind of hard to do with everybody in here. And so the next 6 weeks specifically, we're going to be dealing with questions that really each of us have to answer at some point in our life. Because the answer to those questions has a big effect on how we live our lives. And so I'm excited to talk about those with y'all, and we're going to go into some deeper stuff, and it's going to be a lot to probably maintain, and you're probably not going to remember all of what we're covering, but I think it's going to be really useful, because a lot of times we can come to church, and we come each week, and it becomes like this thing where we just, we're used to just being here, and we kind of take it for granted. That we're Christians and stuff like that, but we kind of forget that there's a reason to believe what we believe, and it changes who we are. It really should change every aspect about us. And y'all are high schoolers, so that means hopefully you'll probably be going off to college sometime soon. And one thing that I learned whenever I went off to college is that's where your faith really gets challenged a lot more. Because right now, if you're here, it might not be, but it could be because you were raised in a Christian household and you were raised going to church. And so sometimes when you go off to college, for the first time, you're hearing other perspectives of people who don't have that perspective. And so many people, their faith just crumbles because they realize they don't have the answer to these questions because they never really thought it through. They've kind of just taken for granted that Jesus is God, I'm a Christian. And all of a sudden, when they're out of that bubble, things get a lot harder. I need to turn this back on. But I don't want that to be the case. So through what we're talking about for today and the next few weeks, I'm hoping that it will actually encourage you in your faith and deepen it so that whenever you go off to college or even at school right now, if you're facing that opposition, that you'll actually have answers to show people that we have reason for what we believe. And this is, so a lot of these, what we're going to be going over the next few weeks is what we would call apologetics, which is just a fancy word for defense. There's a part in the Bible, in I think 1 Peter, where he says, every one of you should be able to give a defense for the hope that is in you. And the word for defense is apologia. So apologetics is when we try to defend our faith. And we're showing that it's not blind faith that we have, because a lot of people think that. They think if you have faith in God, it's just a blind faith. You're just taking a shot in the dark. You're like, I choose this one. That's not what God calls us to. But we have a reason for the faith we have, and ultimately it still comes down to faith. But we want to be able to defend that. And so that's all setting up the first question we're dealing with today. Is God real? And there are multiple ways I could have gone about this lesson. Probably the most common way would be to give you all these different arguments, such as like the cosmological argument, which is saying, look at the world and how did it come into existence? It had to come from a God, intelligent design, right? Or I could talk about the moral argument, which says, look at good and evil. Like if you believe that there is good and there is evil, who makes that standard? And these are all arguments for the existence of God, but I don't want to do that today because in the end, I might be able to speak up here for a few minutes and convince you that there is good reason to believe God exists, but in the end of all that, you still wouldn't know which God, right? I would convince you that there is a God out there maybe, but you wouldn't know which one. Is it the God of Islam, the God of Judaism, the God of Christianity, or one of the other many gods of the different faiths, right? So I decided that there's a better question we can ask, and that is Christianity true? Because if we can answer the question, is Christianity true, not only will we know that God is real, but you'll have to make a choice. And so that's going to be the focus of the talk today, because that's kind of knocking out two birds with one stone. Not only, hopefully by the end of the day, not only will you have confidence that God is real, but you'll have confidence that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that he is one with Father, Son, and Spirit, and that the Bible is trustworthy. And that's actually, the trustworthiness of the Bible is actually what we're going to get more into next week. because that's another thing that comes under challenge a lot. So that gives rise to the question, how do we prove that Christianity is true? And luckily, the Bible actually gives us a kind of litmus test for that. And that's by answering another question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? This is kind of the thing that our faith hinges upon. If Jesus did not die, Paul tells us that our faith is futile. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians. He says, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then our faith is futile and we are still dead in our sins and we need to go look around for some other God. But if Jesus did rise, that confirms everything about Christianity. Because if somebody is going around proclaiming that they are the Son of God, and then they die and come back to life, that's probably a pretty good sign that they meant what they said, right? And so Paul says that, but not only does Paul say that, but Jesus says it himself. Whenever the Pharisees are confronting him, they say, what sign will you give us that you're a prophet? And he says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. And the Bible tells us he was talking about his body. In another place, that's what these verses are at the bottom. In another place, people come up to him, what sign will you give us that your words are the word of God? And he says, the only sign I'll give you is the sign of the prophet Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days under the earth, and then he'll rise. So this is Jesus before his death, prophesying about his resurrection. He's saying, if you want to know that I'm speaking the truth, watch, I'm going to come back to life. And so that's how we're going to test to see if Christianity is true. My goal of today will be to try to demonstrate to you that I believe Christianity is true. And this is different than most other religions. For Islam, the question they'll ask, the way that they'll try to prove that it's true is they'll say, who other than God could have written the Holy Quran? And that's a book, right? So that's more of a subjective question, because it's like, okay, some people might land being like, yeah, you're right, only God could write this. But the book's only written by one guy, Muhammad, right? So it could be that Muhammad sat there and wrote the entire thing. Whereas the Bible is written by over 40 authors over thousands of years, which is what we'll get into next week. But then like the book Mormonism, the way they'll say it is they'll say, you'll read the Book of Mormon and you'll be convinced in your heart that this is the Word of God. The problem with that is that there's been plenty of people who've read the Book of Mormon and they have not felt convinced of that. So that kind of proves that apparently, by their own test, it failed. This gives us a much more objective way of looking at it, right? Either Jesus rose or he didn't rise. It's not relying on your subjective feelings. What we're going to do today is I'm going to present you with 5 different facts that almost all scholars, both Christian and non-Christian alike, agree upon. And hopefully through those 5 facts, you'll be able to make a conclusion on what you think, whether or not Jesus did rise from the dead. And ultimately, you're going to have to take it on faith. But to reassure you, that's what you have to do with all history, right? Who here was present when Washington crossed the Delaware? Okay, yeah, smart guys. No, but y'all weren't there, right? All you can do is you can read what trustworthy eyewitnesses have written down, and it's been passed through the ages, and eventually you have to make a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence you're given. And you take it on faith that that's what happened. So that we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to give you 5 facts that both Christians and non-Christians agree upon, and obviously the non-Christians come up with a different conclusion. But I believe that these 5 facts give us a reasonable reason to believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. So, first fact, a death by crucifixion. Jesus could not have risen from the dead if he did not die first, right? And not only does the Bible testify about this, but we have early sources outside the Bible who agree that Jesus did that he did die by crucifixion. For instance, Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, he was not a Christian, he wrote the following. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. We don't know if the word "the" was there or not. That kind of changes a lot of stuff. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So Josephus, who is not a Christian, writing from the 1st century, just shortly after Jesus died and resurrected, he agrees that Jesus not only died, but came back to life. But for right now, we're not focusing on the resurrection part. We're just focusing on the death. He confirms Jesus is dead. Moving on, we have a guy named Tacitus. This is, like I told y'all, this might be kind of boring to some of y'all, but I'm wanting to give y'all confidence, right? So if this is going over your head, it's fine. Just hang in there. Tacitus was another person who was not very fond of the Christians, as you'll see, but he agrees that Jesus died on the cross. Christus, that's Christ, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. Whenever he refers to the extreme penalty, that's a reference to crucifixion. That was viewed as the most extreme penalty anybody could ever endure. Romans were not allowed to crucify other Romans because it was considered shameful. That's why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because the idea of crucifixion is very shameful. And to say that the Son of God came in the flesh and was crucified is kind of an embarrassing thing to claim. But even Tacitus says that he did endure it. The Jewish Talmud agrees. On the eve of Passover, Jesus was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything on his behalf, let him come forward. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. What's interesting about this source is that you'll notice it's what we would call a hostile source. These are not people who in any way are trying to defend Christianity, right? The Jews, they're the ones who handed Jesus over to be killed. And whenever you read the source, they're actually contradicting a lot of what the Bible says, right? It's actually claiming that Jesus was a false prophet who was enticing Israel to turn away from God. So they're not trying to defend Jesus at all here, but there are little details in there that do kind of, they confirm the Bible, and you could see it as the other perspective, right? You can see it that this is the Jewish perspective of what they did. This is how they justified it. But they do agree that Jesus was hanged, that's, hung from a cross, on the eve of Passover, which the Bible agrees with. It says that he did not, since nothing was brought forward in his favor, both in the book of Isaiah, we read that the Messiah he'll be tried, but he will not open his mouth. And then when we reach the Gospels, it says that Jesus did not offer himself a defense. So we have some things there that they're weird because it's like a different perspective, but what they do agree on is that he says the following. For two obvious reasons, practically no one would deny the fact that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. Reason number one, this central event is reported or alluded to not only by the vast majority of New Testament authors, but also by Josephus and Tacitus. So we have a bunch of people, even outside of the Bible, who do agree Jesus was dead. And secondly, such an embarrassing event created a major obstacle to converting Jews and Gentiles alike. The last thing the church would have done would have been to create a monumental scandal for which it then had to invent a whole apologetic. This is what we call the criterion of embarrassment, which is a huge term, but that basically means you're less likely to tell a false, embarrassing story. So like if I came up to y'all right now and I was like, man, back in the day, I was a world champion ping pong player. Y'all probably be like, that's probably not a true story. It seems like David's just talking himself up. But I was talking to Austin a few days ago in his office, and he told me I had permission to share this story. He said that whenever he got baptized, he really had to use the restroom, right? And he didn't use the restroom in the baptismal pool, but what happened is that they had a place where you change, and then you go in there, and you get baptized, and you come out the other side. And he said, man, as soon as he got out, he just couldn't hold it anymore, and he just beat himself, right? And we're more inclined to believe that story because why would you make something embarrassing like that up, right? Like that's not a story that people don't like being embarrassed. So the fact that the Christians are wanting to say, yes, the Son of God, the God who created the universe, came down in the flesh, and we crucified him. We put the God of the universe up to this shameful death. That's more of an embarrassing story. Why would you make that up? Which actually leads to the second point, the second fact that almost everybody agrees on, which is that ladies found the tomb empty. Every single gospel testifies to the fact that it was women and not men who first found the empty tomb. And the reason people would agree with that is because, once again, the criterion of embarrassment. If you read these sources, you'll see that in the first century, people did not exactly have the best view of women. The Jewish Talmud, once again, this is the general rule. Any testimony for which a woman is not qualified, they too are not qualified. Basically saying women should stay silent. They do not need to share any of their own opinions. Josephus, once again, from the 1st century. But let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at the least, and those such whose testimony is confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, since it is probably that they may not speak truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. Josephus did not have a very high view of women, obviously. But that kind of speaks to, I'm not saying that everybody had that extreme view that Josephus had, but women were not viewed with a very high level of credibility, unfortunately, in the 1st century. And so the fact that the Gospels unanimously agree that it was women who found the tomb first kind of testifies to the validity of that statement. It doesn't guarantee that Jesus resurrected, but it does agree that women found the tomb empty. And people would agree on that because, first off, it hurt the credibility of the story. People from that time were mocking the idea of women finding the tomb first. And then even the disciples didn't believe it. Whenever the women come and tell them, they're like, no, the tomb's not empty. And then that's when Peter and John get up and go check for themselves. So even they didn't kind of hold the women's credibility that highly. So that makes most scholars agree that most likely that is a true statement. Women did find the tomb empty. Whether or not that means Jesus resurrected, we'll get there. But they do agree that happened. Because it just seems more likely if they were making this up, they would choose somebody else to find the tomb empty. Peter, the leader of the apostles, or maybe Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, who are high-ranking Jewish officials. It would make a lot more sense and would give you a lot more credibility to say one of those guys found the tomb empty. But instead, you're saying, some women. Mary Magdalene, you know that girl who, she had 7 demons, and she might have been a prostitute. She's the one who found the tomb empty. That kind of takes away the credibility. But the fact that they testify to that makes it seem like it's true. Which leads to fact number 3, independent appearances alive. We have multiple different people from multiple different occasions all testifying to the fact that they saw Jesus alive after his death. This is a quote from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And that's Paul writing. What you'll notice here, I write at the bottom, this passage is safely dated to about 5 years after the crucifixion. That's because Paul's writing around probably AD 50-ish when he's writing to the Corinthian church, and he's writing a letter to them. And you'll notice he says, I delivered to you before. So he's writing the letter here, and he's saying, whenever I was with you last time, a few years earlier, I delivered this message to you, and what I delivered to you was what I also received even earlier. And the only time we know of Paul being in Jerusalem, other than really close to this letter, was back in the early AD 30s. So it's very close to whenever Jesus was resurrected. And so this is it's almost like a creed. It's have you all ever heard of the Apostles' Creed or something like that? It's I believe in God the Father, I believe in God the Son, that stuff. This almost seems like the first Christian creed. It's talking about who Jesus appeared to. And Paul's saying he appeared to Peter, the leader. He appeared to the 12, all of the main people. But then, here's the kicker, right? In verse 6, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. This is one of the reasons that makes most scholars agree that people saw something. They're not willing to admit that it was a resurrected Jesus, but they saw something because right here he says more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still living. If you were trying to make something like this up, you would probably be like, yeah, Jesus appeared to 50, 500 people, but they're in China or they're dead. You can't ask them about it. But instead, he's like, no, he appeared to 500 people at one time. They're nearby. Go ask them. They'll tell you what they saw. So this is not somebody who's trying to make up something. This is somebody who believes in what he's saying, and he's saying, challenge me. Go ask the people right there. He lives down the street. Go ask him what he saw. Go ask them what they see. they all saw Jesus alive after his death. So that gives us good reason to believe that there were some sort of appearances that people saw. Which leads this person, Paula Fredrickson, she's not a Christian, she's a Jewish historian on the historical Jesus. She used to be a Roman Catholic, but she converted to Judaism. But this is what she says. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. Right? So people aren't willing, they're not saying, okay, we're not going to make a definite claim that they did for sure see the raised Jesus, but they had to see something, because what we see after this is a radical change in the apostles, which leads us to fact number 4 that everybody would agree on. The violence endured by the apostles. This is actually one of the most important reasons why we have reason to believe in the resurrection. Because whenever you read the Gospels and you compare the character of the apostles before the resurrection and after, they're vastly different. Multiple times, Jesus is calling these people, "Oh, you of little faith." Y'all know the story whenever they're like going through the sea, and they start trembling, and there's a storm. They're like, "Jesus, are you like going to let us die?" And then he's like, "Oh, you of little faith." And then he calms the storm. Jesus is always getting on to them about how little faith they have. And multiple times we see that in person. On literally the night that Jesus was arrested, they all scattered. Right? All the guards come, and Jesus hands himself over. Peter at first gets bold and tries to cut off a guy's ear. And so, well, he does cut off the guy's ear. But then, after that, they all flee. They're all scared. If you're trying to make up a fake religion, you're not going to write that about your leaders, right? You're going to be like, "Oh yes, but even whenever times got tough, they stood courageous and tall and did not back down." But instead, you have the gospel writers being like, "No, they fled. Every single one of them, they left." That doesn't give a lot of credibility to somebody if they're trying to start a false religion. You want to make people look really good. But it gets worse. Peter, who is the leader of the 12 throughout the entire Gospels, he decides to double back and go follow Jesus, but then he ends up making things worse by denying Jesus 3 times. And who's he denying to? It's like a servant girl. She's like, "Hey, didn't I see you with Jesus?" He's like, "No, this is the leader of the 12 apostles. And he's denying Jesus on the night when Jesus needs him most. And then Jesus is being walked down, and it says that Jesus looked him in the eyes, then he cried and ran away. That's not something you make up if you're trying to have this guy be the leader of your church. And then, even after Jesus died, where do we see the apostles next? The next time we see them all gathered, they are in a room by themselves, hidden away, locking the door because they're afraid people are going to come kill them too. And that's why it's so significant when Jesus shows up, because they never unlock the door. He just shows up inside. They're like, "Huh." But that's before Jesus died. After Jesus died, we see a radical transformation in these people. They go from being cowering deserters to confident martyrs. All of a sudden, there's this huge change. Even if you just open up the book of Acts, there's a huge change between the apostles of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the apostles of Acts. Because something has happened that has boosted their confidence. And now, today I got to teach chapel twice this morning for the elementary school kids. And I was telling them a story in Acts chapter 4 where Peter and John are standing before the exact same people who crucified Jesus. And they're boldly proclaiming the gospel. This is the same guy, Peter, right, who denied Jesus only 2 months earlier. So the question is, what changed them from these cowering people to these people who are willing to die for their faith? And nobody would deny the fact that they did die for their faith. Tradition testifies to it, not just the Bible. Everybody agrees that the early church for the first 300 years faced severe persecution. It was a horrendous thing. We have it really good here today because we can just all gather here and it's all nice and we can just sit and listen to defending the faith. But they would not be able to do this. They would not be able to have a huge building like this. They were fighting for their lives, and they were willing to give up their lives. Of the original 12 apostles, 11 of them were murdered. So the question is, how does that happen? How do you go from all 12 fleeing? Well, I guess 11 of them, because Judas, he betrayed Jesus. But 11 of them fled, but then they end up dying for their faith. right? How do you account for that huge, huge change? And people will have an objection to this, right? Their objection will be, oh, people die for lies all the time. Maybe they just really wanted to start this religion and they, died for the lie. And you can think that, but that's actually harder to explain. Because the people you see dying for lies are people like terrorists who feel like they're commanded by God to do something. Or they're just deceived by their own teachings, right? And then you have cults who are usually obeying a leader who is telling them to do this. But that's not what you have with the apostles. You don't have people who don't know what they're talking about. They're claiming to be eyewitnesses. So if they're dying for a lie, they're conscious of the fact that it's a lie. And why would you do that? That just doesn't make sense. And what do they gain by the lie? It's not like they're getting a lot of women, or they're getting a lot of riches, or they're getting something from the lie. All they're doing is they're being estranged from their families. They're being stoned. They're being flogged. They're being thrown in prison. And they're dying these horrific deaths, right? They're being crucified. They're being beheaded. What would they possibly gain from lying? So this is a really strong evidence. They must have seen something that really convinced them that Jesus was alive. Which leads us to fact number 5. Enemies of Christ were converted. This is also significant because it causes, it would take something drastic to make this happen. The first two we see there, James and Jude, brothers of Jesus, who throughout the Gospels we see that they are opposed to Jesus' ministry. They're like, you know what, we do not believe that you are who you say you are. And you'd probably agree with that. You could probably resonate with that. Imagine you grew up with your brother your entire life, and all of a sudden he starts going around proclaiming he's the Son of God. You'd be like, I saw you when you had a runny nose. I saw you when you scraped your knee. It's hard to wrap your mind around that, right? I mean, even if he's a totally perfect person, you were probably more aggravated with that half the time because you kept getting in trouble and he wasn't, right? So it's hard for you to think that this person that you've grown up with your entire life is the Messiah, is the Son of God. But all of a sudden, we see that after the resurrection, not only do James and Jude convert to Christianity, but they end up becoming leaders in the church. James ends up dying for his faith. I think Jude probably does too. I don't actually know about that, but he probably does. But they write books of the Bible, right? The book of James and the book of Jude? Those are written by brothers of Jesus. Where elsewhere in the Bible we read they didn't believe. So something happened that caused them to believe that their brother was the Son of God. And it's what could possibly do that? Well, maybe if you saw your brother dead and then you saw him alive after death, that would probably be oh, you know what? Maybe there was some validity to that. And then you have Paul the Apostle, right? He was the lead persecutor of the church. We don't know if he actually killed anybody by his own hands, but he was definitely imprisoning people so that they could be killed. And he was holding the robes of people, holding the robes for people as they stoned the first Christian martyr. And he was leading the persecution against the church, yet all of a sudden, not only does he become a Christian, but he becomes one of the leading apostles. And he writes the majority of the New Testament. This is imagine a member of ISIS converting to Christianity, not just for publicity though. Think this ISIS member had it really well. He was rich and he had everything, but he converts to Christianity only so he can be thrown in prison, he can be beaten, he can be scourged, he can be stoned, he can be mocked, he can be estranged from his family, and he can ultimately be beheaded. That would be a pretty powerful testimony. And Paul doesn't say it was just a change of heart. He says that he had a personal experience with Jesus. He says, I saw him. Right? Last of all, he appeared to me as one untimely born. That's what we read earlier. So these radical transformations occurred after the resurrection. And so you've got to ask yourself, what could have possibly caused these to happen? And so there's your 5 facts. Right? You have a death by crucifixion. You have that ladies found the tomb empty. You have independent accounts of Jesus' resurrection. You have the violence endured by the apostles, and you have the enemies of Christ converted. And those are facts that pretty much all scholars will agree are true. People will disagree on the conclusion of those facts, but I believe that we have a very valid reason to believe that Jesus is alive. I didn't create that acronym, don't worry. If you think it's cheesy, I didn't do it. But I think we have very good reason to believe that Jesus is alive. Because whenever you take those 5 facts, which everybody agrees on, resurrection is the easiest conclusion. If you're going to look at other historical information and make judgment calls, that's what you got to do. You look at the facts you know, and you make the most reasonable conclusion. And there's people who propose other things other than resurrection, but it almost takes more faith to believe those things than it does to believe resurrection. If you believe that it's possible for a man to come back to life, and you believe there is a God, well, then resurrection is the easiest one. The only people who deny it, they've been quoted for saying like, oh, well, I just would never believe in a miracle to begin with. Well, it's like, well, okay, you had a bias going in. But if you look at these 5 facts, I believe we have a reason to believe Jesus is alive. And if Jesus is alive, then that means the resurrection occurred. If the resurrection occurred, that means that Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, that means that Jesus is God. And so then not only do you know that God is real, but you know who God is. And my challenge to you today is that you have a choice to make now. Because hopefully I've given you reason to believe that we have a confident reason to believe in our faith. And it's not just blind faith. It still takes faith, right? You have the facts, and there's still more than that. Those are just like the 5 facts that pretty much everybody agrees on. There's still others that like a majority agree on. Those are just the 5 major ones. And it's not blind faith. It still takes faith because every historical thing that you weren't present for takes faith. Sometimes even if you were present for it, it takes faith because you can't explain it. So my challenge to you is to make a choice, right? I didn't want you to leave here tonight thinking, okay, God is real, but I don't know who he is. I think we have a good reason to believe that God is real and Jesus is God. And so, the challenge to you is if you come to the same conclusion, surrender yourself to him. I don't want this to be purely an intellectual thing that we're doing every 6 weeks, like over the next few weeks. I want it to hopefully be intellectual, but also encourage you to devote yourself to Christ. Because he was a real historical person, and we have real historical evidence to believe that Jesus is God, that he rose from the dead. And I think that it's so cool that God gave us that evidence so that we have a reason to believe, so that when people challenge us, we can tell them that we have a reason to believe. But yeah, that's it. I'm going to pray for us, and then y'all are free to go. I know I went a little bit long, but hopefully it was encouraging to those of y'all who paid attention. Dear God, thank you. Thank you for not only making yourself known to us, but making yourself so known that we can actually defend the fact that you've made yourself known. Let us never think that we're just called to some blind faith, and let us never think that just knowing something intellectually is the same as exercising faith. There might be people here today who hear what I've said, and they might agree, you know what? I think Jesus is resurrected. I think he is God. But you know, the demons, they know that Jesus is God, and they know that he came back from the dead, but they don't give themselves to him. They tremble at that. But there's a difference because they don't exercise faith in you, God. So let us not just take this knowledge and just put it in the back of our brains, but let us do something with it. Let us go out into this world and show people that we have a reason for what we believe. We're not just blindly believing in some, some fairy tale in the sky. We're believing in the God who created the universe and who's given us reason to believe that we can know him. So as we leave here today, let us go from here changed. Let us be confident in our faith, and let us go out and live boldly. And as the early apostles did, let's go out there and change the world for you, God, no matter what it takes. We have it really good here, and we've got a really comfortable life here in America. So let's not take that for granted, but let's go out and change the world for you, God. Thank you so much for all you've done. Let us just live for you more. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
I thank you, Father, for sending your Son and giving your Spirit that we may be one with each other, united in you, dead to our old self.